Hello everyone, so today we're starting the first of 4 weeks of discussion about quantitative research and what it is. We're going to be starting out by looking at the big picture, understanding the basis of quantitative research and some of the big questions that guide a research project. We're going to go through one by one what you'll need to create your presentation and your project for assignment 2. In higher education, learning takes a different form. We're not just learning what people have already discovered, we're making discoveries, and we do that by asking questions. As Postman and Weingartner wrote, knowledge is produced in response to questions, and new knowledge results from the asking of new questions, quite often new questions about old questions. So here's a very simplified view of how research comes about. Firstly, you look at previous data, previous research. We call this literature. You look at the problem and how it already has been studied, and you develop a plan for how you are going to study it. Previous researchers always work with something called theory. They either develop theory or they discuss it or they test it. And theory is an explanation about the relationship between one thing and another thing. For example, a simple theory could be that a language program by a university can help students increase their writing skills. That could be a theory about the relationship between a language program and their writing skills. So from the theory and from previous data, you come up with a plan. The plan is your methodology or your method. The research method is really important. It usually follows guidelines and ethics and various requirements so that it is indeed a valid and reliable plan of research that is going to yield results that are usable, applicable, considered valid. From your plan, you develop a way of approaching your population and selecting the population, that is, the people you want to study, because we're concerned with social research and the study of people in this subject. Next comes the process of research. You actually carry it out and you use your survey, you collect the data. And then once you have the data, because you've planned it well, you're able to process the data, to discuss it, to look at it from various angles, to use the data that you have planned to answer the question that you designed the survey to answer. And you designed the data collection methods and the data analysis methods to answer the question. Everything is very well organized and planned. And when you do so, you have your product, you have your results, your data, and your findings, which you're able to share and publish. And that is the new knowledge, the contribution that you have made to human knowledge. So let's talk about the thinking behind quantitative research. What is the way in which it approaches? This is known as epistemology. Well, the first thing you should know is that quantitative research is deductive rather than inductive. Deductive reasoning or research makes specific conclusions from general theories. You take the general theory about relationships between ideas and you try to apply it to very specific circumstances, and you test the theory to see if it applies. Inductive reasoning draws general theories from specific observations. You study something small and then you draw wider theories about the relationships between general things from your specific observations and studies. Quantitative research is also more objectivist than it is constructionist. Constructionism is about subjectivity and how human beings interpret and frame the world and understand it. For example, constructionists would say that different cultures have different ways of perceiving color. constructionists might talk about how in some cultures red and pink are considered completely different colors, whereas in another culture there might not even be a word for a certain color because it's not considered a color in its own. Objectivism focuses more on scientific realities such as light and different wavelengths of color, how color is perceived by our eyes, rather than how color is interpreted and understood by various cultures. All in all, quantitative research focuses on the reality or the truth or the knowledge that is something that we can observe. That's not just how we understand things, philosophies, ideas in our minds. Rather, reality is external and objective, physical. Let's talk through some of the main characteristics of quantitative research. Firstly, quantitative research is very structured. It's very planned. You don't really have open-ended questions. You don't let the people that you're studying kind of define the study for you. You have to look at things and you have to plan it in advance in detail so you get the kind of data that you can use to answer your question, that you can analyze in a certain way, that you can input. And so it has to be very, very organized and precise. Secondly, you're working with larger numbers of people. You're trying to understand, for example, the entire population of Malaysia, or you're trying to understand how women across Southeast Asia perceive gender in the workplace. For example, you're trying to represent a broad population, so you try to take samples of people. These may represent different age groups, different income brackets, and you then are able to generalize what you find from your sample to the larger population. Your study should be so well designed that someone else can take the exact same methods that you used and study a similar population of people and find the same results. If your experiment, your scientific experiment, can be repeated, this means that you have used a reliable measure, a reliable method. Now, you should have a clear objective and purpose from the start because you're looking for objective answers. Again, clarity and planning is what it's about. Careful planning before your data collection. Now, you want to take the numerical and statistical data that you find and present it as tables, charts, and figures. This we've already discussed. And then you also want to take the concepts that you have found and you can use them and generalize them to further populations. You can use the data to predict future results, or you can explore cause and effect. Finally, you often use computer software and questionnaires, data analysis, statistical software, for example, to help you with your data collection and with your data analysis. It's often a very technologically enhanced form of research that really ties in well with big data and big data research, which is a slightly different but related field. Let's talk a little bit more about the purpose of quantitative research. That is, what do we actually set out to find? What kind of knowledge? Well, it's about the relationship between A and B. You have these two things and you want to find out their relationship. A is called the independent variable. That's the main focus. B is the dependent variable, the one that you're comparing to A. You want to find out what A's relationship to B is. If I were to draw it out, for example, let's take the independent variable to be a student's grades in university, and let's take the dependent variable to be a language program. Does the language program increase their grades? Is there a relationship between these two variables, one there where there's a correlation, that an increase in one means an increase in the other, a positive correlation? Now, there are two ways of going about quantitative research that we're going to focus on today. Descriptive research means trying to go out and find associations. You decide, I'm going to study the relationship between this and that, and I'm going to go out, I'm going to measure it once, I'm going to do one survey, and that's all. Now, there's also the experiment where you find cause and effect, and you test this by measuring once before, for example, the language program. You measure the students' grades or their writing skills, and then you conduct the language program, and then you test again. You apply your measure or your survey or your test after, and you try to see if before and after there's a difference, and if that difference is strong enough to imply cause and effect. This is how medicines are also tested. So let's go back to the purpose of quantitative research. That includes classification of different features, concepts, counting, and the construction of statistical models to explain what is observed. The 3 C's of quantitative research, if you will. At the core of quantitative research is the research problem. The reason why we need a research problem is because we need something worth researching. What are we studying? Why are we studying it? What is the significance? There must be an issue, a cause, a problem that prompts us to do the research that makes it actually worthwhile. Secondly, you have a theory. You always base your research on previous theories, explanations of complex relationships between variables. So we talked about variables. Theories are suggestions or ideas of previous research about how these variables are related. And these help us generate hypotheses, which are guesses of the relationship that you're going to discover in your study. Finally, we have concepts. If you're going to study 2 things, you're going to be very clear about what those 2 things are. Concepts are the building blocks of theory because, in order to have a relationship defined, you need to know what A is and what B is. For example, if you're studying prejudice, how do you define prejudice? How do you measure prejudice? Do you ask people to rank certain prejudicial statements from 1 to 5, like strongly disagree to strongly agree, for example? How do you measure addiction? How do you test if someone is addicted? Perhaps, how often they use social media or how often they consume coffee. These are measures of addiction, and you have to define your concepts really clearly. What is respect? How do you define if someone respects someone of, say, a different ethnicity or a different gender? How would you figure out if they have a level of respect or not? And in order for it to be quantitative research, you need to be able to have different levels of it, as we shall soon discuss, in order to be able to actually quantify it and make it into a statistic and compare this with something else. How do you measure understanding of consent, or how do you measure stress? These are concepts that you must specify very, very exactly and define very clearly. We're going to talk about survey design next week. Next week, we're going to start building the surveys, and I'm going to help you design them in such a way to be able to measure what you're trying to study really clearly. Why do we need measurements? Well, we need to delineate and define differences. For example, you want to find out about someone's job satisfaction. Do you simply ask them, do you love your job, A, or do you B, hate your job? Well, we can't just have that. We need more detail. We need more specifics. And to do that, we need to have in-between measurements. We need to have various degrees between loving your job, being really enthusiastic, or maybe hating your job or having a very low level of enthusiasm or motivation. Secondly, you need a consistent device or yardstick for distinctions. These cannot be affected by the time or time period you're in or by the individual researcher and how they conduct the survey. You need to yield consistent results, and so your measurements have to be consistent. Finally, you need precise estimates of degrees of relationships between concepts. For example, you want to measure if job satisfaction increases when people believe that they are being paid fairly. So you want to have degrees. You want to be able to compare the various degrees. And to do that, again, you need precise estimates of degrees, like I said with point 1. And because that will help you determine correlations and different relationships better. Alright, so I hope this is a clear introduction. We're going to come up with a checklist of various things that you need to have in place for assignment 1 in your groups. The information in this lecture are based on 2 different research method books by Bryman 2014 and Bebby 2012. Finally, I've also attached 2 different videos that I hope will be helpful and interesting to you as we try to wrap our minds around quantitative research.